In my haste to begin this talk with a picture of a grey squirrel and a frog, I've cut all the funders logos off. Sorry. This project really couldn't have happened. The Pine Marten element couldn't have happened without the Welsh Mountain Zoo, the Wildwood Trust, and the New Forest Nature Centre down by Southampton, because they're the three zoos, or three of the zoos, which breed pine martens, and they're the three zoos which provided the pine martens which are now running around in Gwynedd. So I wanted to talk really about a little bit about the history of squirrels in North Wales, but not too much. I want to touch upon why pine martens may well be important for squirrel ecology in the UK, and then we'll delve into what we've been doing over the last 2-3 years with the translocation of pine martens into northern Gwynedd. So pine martens form an important part of a new project which has been developed, which is called Magical Mammals. It's a Heritage Lottery funded project. It's in its development phase. Like many projects, because of the COVID pandemic, it's been delayed, but it's going to, when it comes, if we're lucky enough to get the funding, this will be a 5-year project, which will cover Cloclinog Forest with its red squirrels, the red squirrels in Gwynedd, which are largely in Treborth Vale, but there are some in the Conwy Valley. And Anglesey, of course, is a stronghold for the species in Wales. And it will translocate pine martens, so it will build upon the pilot work that I'm going to tell you about this evening. So for those of you that don't know much about pine martens, and I have to say, a couple of years ago, I knew virtually nothing. I knew what they were, but I didn't really know much about their ecology. So they're a medium-sized carnivore, so they're weighing between 1.4 and 2 kilograms in weight. And we've got, I'll tell you about the 4 animals that we've released. And the females weighed 1.5, and the largest male that we had was about 1.8 kilograms. They have this odd delayed implantation where the females enter estrus in 1 year. The eggs are fertilized, and then the egg doesn't develop, or there's a delayed implantation of the fertilized egg in the following year. And they have small litters, and they breed late. So unlike red squirrel, which will breed the year after it's born, pine martens don't do that. And red squirrels will breed twice. Some red squirrels, because of climate change, are now even breeding so that we have almost no reproductive inactivity in the population because it's so warm in the winter time. And pine martens are very conservative breeders. They're territorial. So again, this is a difference with red squirrel. Red squirrel has a home range and overlaps with other animals. And you'll see that if you're lucky enough to live on Anglesey, you'll see multiple squirrels visiting feeders in woodlands, or you might be lucky enough to have them in your garden. The red squirrels will live in fairly high densities. You may get them at 2 per hectare. Typically in broadleaf woodland, they're going to be a bit lower than that, about 1 per hectare. If you go to the Llangefni Dingle and you walk through, you'll be lucky enough to see 5-6 squirrels with ease in that woodland. Pine marten's different, it's territorial. And typically, although not always, you have a male that overlaps 2 females. They're arboreal, so just like red squirrel, they're arboreal. They spend a lot of the time up in the trees. But they do spend time on the ground, and they're vole specialists, the small mammal specialist. Omnivorous, their diet varies, fruit, small mammals, birds, eggs, beetles. If you watch Spring Watch, I think they've been feeding them various custard cream biscuits. Very, very wide variety of different foods. And where do they sleep? They sleep in tree hollows inside the cavities of rotten stems of trees. They'll go into squirrel nests. They'll nest. They're then under boulders in sort of scree. So if you look in North Wales and you look on the sides of slopes and you see these boulder fields, they're ideal for martens. And they have predators. They themselves, as a predator, are predated by other predators. And one of those is lynx. And you've probably seen in the news, there's quite an exciting proposition to reintroduce lynx back into Scotland. Lynx obviously extinct in Wales. Red fox is here, common, and that's a major predator of pine marten. And then larger raptors may take them, golden eagle, for example. I suppose the thing that's brought pine martens to the fore in terms of national media is its interaction with grey and red squirrels. And the grey squirrel, of course, is not native to the UK. It was brought in 1876, or perhaps slightly earlier. There's an earlier record for Wales, but 1876 is definite. It's the first confirmed. And that translocation was followed by subsequent translocations, the movement of animals from North America directly into the UK. And then there were movements of animals within the UK, and they spread. And we know that they were introduced into Henbury Park in Cheshire. They made their way from England through North Wales, and by the 1960s they were on Anglesey, and by the 1990s they'd almost completely wiped out the red squirrel, which is when Esme Kirby stepped in with Lady Anglesey to begin this pioneering project to try and reverse the fortunes of the native red. And it was a huge success, although when we started, we were unsure that red squirrels even still persisted on the island. There was very little data. Anglesey, of course, has a huge advantage over a lot of locations because it has a big moat round it. It has the Menai Strait. And for those of you not familiar with it, here it is. This is Bangor. And looking over this, the lovely Glengarth Flats, a prominent location on the coast, which is a notable feature. Through, and then if you were to look really closely, you'd see the two bridges. So it's linked by the Britannia Bridge and by the Menai Suspension Bridge. And this is a map showing the urban areas in dark. So there's Bangor, and then the woodland in green. And you can see Bangor actually has quite a lot of woodland. I think it's about 20% woodland. So for a city, it's doing really well. And then you have the Penryn Estate, the Ogwen Valley, there's Bethesda, and there's Menai Bridge, and then the Clamper PG, of course, and Plasnowith, where we released red squirrels back in 2006. It's one of I think it was the second translocation that we did on the island. So if we were to look here, we now have red squirrel across Anglesey with no grey squirrel. And in 2010, they crossed the Menai Straits, made life really complicated for us. And they colonised Treborth Gardens and Vaynol, where they still persist to this day. And then, as I said earlier, they've moved up into the Ogwen Valley, and occasionally we get them in brewery fields and a couple of times in Penryn Estate near the old Penryn Point and the docks. Very, very rare. Of course, grey squirrel ubiquitous on this side. So eradication of grey squirrel is probably the headline, but the reality is it was an eradication to a boundary, and that boundary, water boundary, has two bridges over which grey squirrels can easily move if they wanted to. And we've got some nice pictures of grey squirrels swimming around in the Menai Strait too. So there's no doubt about it. It's a barrier, but it's permeable. And so in the long run, we've got to do something about the grey squirrels on the mainland side. There's been a lot of press coverage recently about immunocontraceptive delivered by hoppers. That will probably get licensed and people will use it. But of course, it's only as good as your neighbour's effort. If your neighbour's not controlling grey squirrels, then you're just going to inherit their young, even if you've sterilised the animals that live on your land. So martens and squirrels. Emma Sheehy's PhD research, gosh, when was it? 6 years ago, probably now. They published, I think, in 2014. That showed this correlation between the return of red squirrel in the Irish Midlands, the decline of grey squirrel, and this upsurge in pine marten, this recovery in pine marten populations. It was really significant. They didn't give a cause, but they showed a strong correlation. So the evidence was pointing towards pine marten doing something to help red squirrel. And then we've got Josh's work. I've misspelled, look at that, I've misspelled his name. He's looked at red and grey squirrels with pine martens in Northern Ireland. And they've done quite a nice paper on diet, where they found, in this third bullet point here, they found these differences that more grey squirrel tends to appear in the diet than red squirrel. And the grey squirrels are turning up at times when young animals are in the nest, which is obviously suggestive of predation of young before they've weaned or at weaning, when they're vulnerable. But bullet point 4, this urban areas. So where pine martens can't persist, and obviously pine marten needs woodland, and needs significant amounts of woodland. If you've got urban areas with parkland and grey squirrels being fed, taking advantage of bird feeders or other sources of food in an urban environment, and the predators absent, you can see how the urban environment could be a refuge for them. So if we just look at the Irish data, this is from the latest survey done in 2019. And here we've got this distribution of red squirrel now, which is really good in the Irish Midlands in particular, this big recovery. Grey squirrel being pushed out onto the edges of the Republic and in the north, and then pine marten. This pine marten recovery, which is quite impressive, and is continuing. So you have grey squirrel expansion in some areas where there's not many pine martens. Elsewhere you have grey squirrel decline, or it's disappeared, or it's at a level it's hard to detect. And pine marten coming back, and red squirrel doing really well. I don't think in my talk I've got a figure for the Welsh distribution, but if you Google it, you'll see that we have reds in Cwclainog, Anglesey, a small population in mid Wales, and that's about it. So we certainly don't have anything like this. This is lovely, and this is what we want to have again in Wales. So if we think about the possible the mechanism by which pine marten might affect grey squirrel, what could that be? Well, I've mentioned that this predation of young greys in the drays and in the dens. Predation of adults could occur, and definitely there's a difference in the behavior of nursing female grey squirrels compared with red squirrels. If you go to a nest of young red squirrels, the female may well come back, but she's certainly going to keep her distance from you. If she's present, she'll likely again move away from the nest, but stay in the vicinity. Grey squirrel's very different than that. This animal will come straight at you. It'll be up and down the tree, very agitated. Before you're even down the ladder or climb down the tree, it's gone into the nest. And that potentially could make it much more vulnerable to an arboreal mammalian predator. What about levels of stress? That's possible. We know that the prey do get stressed by the presence of a predator. Less likely is this zoonotic infection. In other words, pine marten's carrying something which is pathogenic to the grey squirrel, a virus of some description or another pathogen. That doesn't seem likely. A few years ago, everyone was talking about landscape of fear, that the grey squirrels had basically ran away. I've often talked about this. If you want to see landscape of fear in action, go to the Welsh Mountain Zoo. There's tigers in an enclosure there, and grey squirrels quite frequently live nearby and run into the enclosure. They're not afraid of large cats. They're not afraid of your cat. I don't think there's any evidence they're afraid of a pine marten. The evidence from Emma Sheehy's work in Scotland with Xavier Lambin is quite the contrary. They don't seem that bothered by the presence of pine marten. So that's the last one, this naivety of grey squirrel, whereas red squirrel may have more of an inherent inbuilt desire to stay away, to react towards the presence of this predator and behave in a way that reduces likely predation. So now we get into what we were doing. Matt Hayward and I, in 2016, we were talking about pine martens and would they be useful as a tool, a potential tool to suppress grey squirrel populations in northern Gwynedd to protect Anglesey, because no one wants to be chasing grey squirrels on Anglesey once they've moved in, crossed the bridge, swam over, come over in a car, dumped deliberately. However they get there, someone's got to find them, and it's incredibly expensive, time consuming and difficult. So if we had a natural way to suppress population, then that would seem quite an enviable opportunity to progress, if we could get animals, of course. And getting hold of animals is challenging. to acquire them from Scotland would have meant a license application to the Scottish government plus a license to NRW. It becomes very difficult and complicated. Whereas if you use captive animals, their legal status is different. They're owned by the zoological collection where they're housed. And because they're a naturally occurring animal in the UK, you don't need a license to release them into the environment. But you do need to follow the IUCN guidelines on translocation, and the welfare of the animal is covered by animal welfare legislation, domestic animal welfare legislation. So you can't just chuck it out and abandon it. You have to evidence that you've taken steps to make sure that these animals are buffered from this living in a captive environment, this transitional period through to becoming wild. And of course, as soon as you open an enclosure and deliberately allow an animal out into an environment, a captive animal out into an environment, its legal status changes. It changes from domestic to wild, and then it is afforded all the protection of the Wildlife and Countryside Act. So the martens that we've released that are now roaming around the Bangor area, even though they were born in captivity, they're now protected by the Wildlife and Countryside Act. It's an offence to kill them. It's an offence to damage where they nest. They're protected. So what do we do to get us to this sort of position of being able to release them? Well, the first thing to do was to gather a group of like-minded individuals, so vets, scientists, zoo staff, conservationists, and there's a virologist there too, David, get together and work out a plan. And the plan meant a lot of paperwork following the IUCN guidelines. If you've ever looked at those, there's an appendix that goes with it. Then you basically write your proposal and then you screen it against the IUCN requirements, and you have to evidence what you've done and why you believe that you have satisfied all the criteria that are there. So this has ended up being a 57-page document. We took the step, and it worked really well, actually. We consulted with NRW without prejudice. So we said to them, we want to talk about pine marten translocation. Whatever you say to us during that discussion, we won't hold it against you when you make your final decision as to whether to support the project, to be neutral towards it, or to oppose it. And it was great. We had really good discussions with them. They shared a lot of information. They gave a lot of guidance. It was great. It's just what the IUCN probably envisaged, because at an early stage in any conservation translocation, you have to have meaningful discussion with the statutory nature conservation body. So we did that, and like as I said over and over again, it was great. We then had to follow what the Office of the Chief Veterinary Office for Wales had recommended for disease surveillance and contingency plans. So again, that was written into the IUCN document. But like all of these assessments, there is a weakness. It's a self-assessment. And so obviously, if you've spent a lot of time and effort writing a document, you're doing it with a view that you want to put animals out. So the links consultation that's going on just now in Northern Scotland will be just the same. They obviously want to put links out. And just as we did, they've gone to public consultation. They have to listen to what people say. And their hope will be just as ours was, that people will support it and that the agencies will support it, or at worst, be neutral towards it. So that's a lot of time. This is from 2016 and took us through into 2018 to early 2019. Part of it was to look at woodland cover. Pine martens needs approximately 120 hectares of woodland. And so we used GIS. Again, there's Bangor, there's the Menai Strait, there's Anglesey, here's the Menai Strait. And then this is a GIS layer. And we just put in different search headings to work out what amount of hectareage of which type of habitat there was. So here we've got semi-natural woodland, there's broadleaf plantation, etc., etc. And you could put in heath, you could put in open hill, whatever you want, grassland. You put it in, you pull it out, and then you look at this from a pine marten's perspective. Remember that they need woodland, but they're also a field vole specialist, so they do need areas of rank grassland, and they eat a lot of fruit. So vaccinium, crabapple, rowan, etc., are really important to them at certain times of the year. So this is, if I just go back, can we see it on the, so this is up here. This is in the Gwynedd Valley. There's this part of the slate tip for the waste slate. So Penryn slate quarry is here, but the town of Bethesda, you can't quite see it. This is Brychmelin Forest, and then the A5 road is on the other side of this hill. And this is looking further up the Gwynedd Valley. A lot of broadleaf woodland, lots of areas of gorse further up in the mountain, bracken, rank grass, lots of rowan trees, varying habitat in the conifer, the plantation there, just as elsewhere, that has certain species. Wood mice are present. You get pigeons roosting, corvids nesting. In more open areas, you're going to get different types of songbirds, and then in the rank grasslands, you're going to have these vole populations, which are a prominent part of pine marten diet in certain seasons. So we looked at all of this, and this was all factored into our assessment. Now, back in 2018, during the Beast from the East storm, we had a captive marten at that time, actually in the Gwynedd Valley in an enclosure. It was owned by the Welsh Mountain Zoo, and it was there as part of this developing acquisition of animals for translocation. And the enclosure was destroyed in the storm, and so we had to try and find her and get her back. And what was fascinating was that she was really difficult to find. She certainly wasn't in the vicinity of the enclosure. There was no evidence. I had about 80 camera traps out for 4 or 5 months, and I didn't get her on any of my cameras. She was picked up elsewhere by chance, and we got video of her different angles, and we were able to determine from her bib pattern, from her throat, with the creamy fur, has different patterns on different animals, different speckling, the characteristic marks that you can differentiate animals from one another. And so this was her. So we knew that without any help at all from us, she had survived at least 3 months and moved quite a distance. And the data from her was quite useful. It gave us an idea of how far they might go once we let them out. Of course, she wasn't radio collared. In the future, we did the proposal, and as it turned out during the actual project, when we got permission, we radio collared. If you're interested in any of this and the rest of the talk, any of the science behind it and the objectives, it's in a paper in Food Webs. You can get it online. I think it's still free access. If not, you can Google. I'm sure you can find, with a little bit of creative Googling, you can find a free way to access it. Not that I would ever suggest you do that without paying, but there we are. It's a good paper, written by Jack Bamber. And also we published in The Conversation, Matt Hayward and I. So there's another article there which talks about pine marten in Northern Gwynedd. So this is the area we're talking about, Arfon district, opposite Anglesey. This is where we want to put the martens. So the first thing that we had to do was to build some enclosures, or beg, steal and borrow enclosures, because we don't have much of a budget. That's the other thing about translocations. The big ones, the pioneers, tend to get a lot of money because they're new, novel, and attractive for funders. Not everyone can do project or get hold of significant amounts of money, and yet really we need to find efficient ways and cost-effective ways of releasing animals if we're going to do it on a large scale and get landscape recovery across the UK. And so this is interesting. We like I said, we borrowed and cannibalized any enclosures that we could get in order to put something together, and we managed to get 3 enclosures. And there's a picture of one of the martens in the box. These boxes are just the same as the VWT used in Mid Wales, and the same as researchers use in Galloway in Scotland, where this pine marten was translocated in the 80s, I think. So these are relatively small enclosures, but they've got branches, nest boxes. Obviously, you can provide them with food. The animals sleep inside the nest boxes. They will scat on top of the boxes, which is quite common in the wild. You can put piles of logs in there and you can present them with food. And these animals arrived in 2019, and we had various delays. I won't go into why, but we had some delays. And then, of course, we had COVID in 2020. And from a captive animal perspective, these animals have lived all their life in an enclosure, so prolonged residency within these enclosures, although it wasn't ideal for them, they're used to it. If we'd had wild martens and been delayed, and the pandemic had then delayed us further, that would have been really, really difficult. There would have been welfare issues over that. So pine martens have this sort of resilience. They're used to close proximity of people, although they're not tame. And so the animals live there, and their body weights, when we finally did the health screening and radio collaring, their body weights were perfect, and the blood test results were very positive too. Now, of course, we can't enrich, excuse me, we can't enrich the environment for the animals using live prey. That's not allowed. So we have to present them with the range of different types of food that they would encounter in the wild. So fruits and berries are obviously easy. Dead grey squirrels, where we were culling grey squirrels routinely, so we could provide those. We did get a few road casualty birds and things like that. The enclosures are in woodlands, so the martens would see and have come from zoos which have woodland around them, so they will have seen there too. Obviously, small mammals at nighttime and birds during the day. We know, because we had camera traps in. Paul Harry helped us enormously videoing these animals for us. Paul's a real tech whiz from mid Wales, and he some fantastic stuff. I'll show some later on, but he got a nice picture of a mouse actually in the enclosure. So we were aware that potential prey were going into the enclosures, but these animals, other than that, we have no evidence that they have any hunting experience whatsoever. And that is the biggest concern when you're releasing a predator. Obviously, it relies on its hunting ability and its efficiency. Now, the paper I showed you earlier, Jack Bamber's paper in Food Webs, he looked at personality, or really boldness, shyness of the martens. And what was interesting were the two female martens that he looked at took quite a long time to come out from the nest box if you provided food, whereas the male that he looked at was out very quickly, and he was able to partition out a level of boldness between these individuals, which is useful then when you look at what they do when you release them. So we have these scores, if you like, which we can then have a look at in comparison with perhaps territory, size, activity from camera trapping once the animals are released, etc. So it's a good baseline data set. So health checks. John Lewis, and unfortunately the late John Lewis, because John passed away, but John was fantastic, the most fantastic zoo vet. He was a dream. Translocations are difficult. It's stressful for the animals, and it's stressful for the researchers too. And to have someone like John come along and talk us through it, he knocked all the animals out, blood sampled them, he sent away all the tests, the histological samples for testing, radio collared them for us, and he just talked us through it, and it was fantastic. We got some brilliant videos of the four animals, and we were also able to get some videos of them whilst they were at the zoo too. So we have this history, and the animals are in a stud book, so they have a life history, a bloodline that they can be traced back. So they're of known age. They have parents which are identifiable, and that's another positive compared with wild animals, where you catch them and you don't know who their parents were, or what their history is. These animals have a defined history. So they've lived in captivity. They obviously have used nest boxes just in the same design that we were going to use when the animals were housed in enclosures and then when they were released. So what we did was each animal had 2 boxes in the enclosure, and just before they were released, one of the boxes was taken out and put in a tree nearby. And so the idea there was that they would come out and they would find that box, they would be comfortable using it because it smells of them. Unfortunately, when we let them out, none of them hung around. So despite all the effort to cushion them, they left. So we didn't just have the single box, we had multiple boxes in the area around each enclosure. Martens will bring prey back to nest boxes, and they'll consume them there. And here's the remains of a pigeon in the bottom of a nest box. This is a box that's actually in the wild near Bangor. So again, if you're interested in these boxes, you can Google it. There's lots of videos. VWT have got some really nice literature about them. So we released the first 3 Martens were released in July, and then the 4th was released in September of 2020. And we radio tracked them, and we use triangulation. So we take 4 bearings from a known location, and those 4 bearings put into a computer program that will work out a location for each animal. And then you can do an alternative, which is follow-up. Now, follow-up's not routinely used for pine martens because you can end up chasing the animal. You're driving it forward by following up. But these are captive martens, and it's really important that we make sure that we can evidence their welfare. And triangulation on its own is not good enough. We use camera traps, so hence these images. But follow-up's good because you actually find where the animal is, and sometimes you can see it. So you're able to say, okay, it's high up in a tree, or I've just seen its eyes in the head torch. So we use both these, and this data will be used to work out the range, the animal's range. So when we released them, obviously we had hoped that they would stay around the enclosures. For the first 3 that we released didn't do that. They didn't stay the following day in the enclosure in the nest box or any of the boxes that we put up nearby. One female used boulder field. This is high in the mountainside, and she'd actually used another set of boulders much later on. But the 2 times we've recorded her doing that. One of the animals went to ground in this is a wall with a whole load of brash or fall at the top of a fallen tree, but effectively makes it even more, gives the animal even more cover, and the animal was in there. So these animals were on the ground. One of the females, the first time we found her, she was under a fallen tree, under the root plate. So that's interesting. You get the sense that they've just found anywhere to get under cover until it got dark again. Whereas if you were to look at what these animals are doing now, very different behavior. They've got nests that they use repeatedly, and they use a variety of sites and den sites. They'll use squirrel nests. They'll use one used a buzzard nest. They'll use hollows in trees. And there we have. This is a birch tree. It'd be better if I had a scale on here, but this is a big, thick trunk. It's about 1.5 feet here. And a big hollow coming down into an even wider part of the trunk. This is Bangor, and these lucky people didn't realize that they had a pine marten staying in their garden once. He stayed there all through the day, didn't budge, and that was a pigeon nest. But now they tend to use nests that are much more tucked out the way or high up. So again, drays or pigeon nests, or it's really difficult to see actually. Quite often you just see dark, there's some structure there, but what built it, it's really hard to tell from the ground because you just don't get a good enough view. And then we look at diet and what were they doing? Well, they started to kill things. There's no doubt about it. And this was a grey squirrel's tail, a fresh tail. And above in the oak tree was a squirrel dray, and that's where the marten was sleeping. So here's a captive female marten And there's no doubt she killed the occupant, or she killed the grey squirrel and then used the grey squirrel dray, whichever. But from a captive marten perspective, this is good news, able to hunt. This is the remains of a pigeon, and this wasn't actually killed by a marten. This was killed by a hawk, plucked, partially consumed, and then part of it left. And I put a camera on it, and actually the marten came along and scavenged. So we've got hunting, we've got scavenging, and then it's a bad picture, but this is scat full of seed fruit. So these captive martens are eating a wide variety of different foods, just as a wild marten would do. And we're going to have a study looking at that, because this is one of the really interesting things. Captive carnivores don't have the experience of hunting, and it's the biggie. When you read all the literature, it's like they can starve to death, and you need them to be able to hunt. And if these animals are able to hunt, we can demonstrate it, then all the better for the future use of captive martens and translocations. Now, this is one of the female martens with a radio collar on. Here we are. It's a low-tech collar, and we've had one collar fail, and then this collar came off. So when the collar comes off, and it's off for, I think it's about 4 hours. Once it's off for 4 hours, the collar gives off a standard, it gives off a pulse, if you like, a noise. It makes a noise when you're listening to it in the headphones, a bit like a submarine sonar, if you like. And there's a distinctive gap between each pulse. That gap shortens if the collar hasn't moved for 4 hours, and you get more of a rapid pulse, and it's the mortality signal. And so this collar was giving off the mortality signal. And that means you get out the car, you hear the mortality signal, your heart sinks, you go into the dark thinking, oh no, it's dead. And now I'm going to pick up a corpse. You have to search for it. And I found where it was coming from. It was inside of an oak tree. And luckily I was able to, because it was rotten, I was able to make a hole. And this was the hole I made to look inside. And there's the part of the heat shrink. And as soon as I touched that with a piece of a pole, the collar went back to normal pulse rate. I was able to recover the collar, obviously, took a photograph of it. Then I was really worried that maybe the marten was dead. You convince yourself, oh no, maybe it is dead, and it's stuck in the top, and the collar somehow came off. And whilst the animal was only a foot away. So I put a camera out, and then you get a picture of the marten. So we've got one marten who shed her collar. We have one marten with a failed collar that doesn't operate anymore. We have a male marten with a collar that's still working. He's tracked. And then we have the fourth of the animals which we released, where we lost contact with him in the first month. Now, maybe the collar failed. We're not sure. Maybe he's moved away. We've searched all over so if he's moved, he's gone a good distance. I think he may well be still around, because they're so difficult to monitor. We found it really difficult without the radio collars to find out where they were. And sometimes they come onto, you get them on cameras. Sometimes I've had, I now know the marten was still there, but I was putting feed hoppers out with peanuts, with bait with fish oil, all sorts of things, and nothing at all. And then all of a sudden you get the animal on a camera. So it's possible the fourth animal is around, but certainly if someone had said at the beginning of this project 3 of the 4 will be living around Bangor 6 months after you started the project, I would have taken that. And 2 of them are females, which is great. Now, I said at the beginning, I mentioned Paul Harry and technical stuff, and Paul built this amazing chip reader, because the animals are all pit tagged, just like your dog or your cat might be. So they have an identification that you can read with a pit tag scanner, just again like a vet will do if you take your animal in to get it looked at. And when these animals visit this particular apparatus, what it does is it records their visit, it records the chip, the presence of the chip in proximity with the feeder, and then you get a data set. And so we have a Marten here, 832, which is the male, and then 970, which is the female. And then sometimes when a presence was recorded, but there was no chip. So that could be something else opening the lid that's not chipped, maybe a squirrel or something like that. But there you have periods of time you can identify the presence, which is great because 970 doesn't have a collar anymore. I can't track her, but the RFID will tell me if she's still around. And again, I can put a camera on like I did here. So you not only do you get the chip number, but you can see her. You can get an idea, is she moving okay? Has she got any cuts, abrasions, swellings, etc., etc. Again, evidence to be able to show the Home Office and the vets in Wales, the government vets, that we're monitoring these released captive animals because their welfare is our priority. So the sort of preliminary findings that we've had, the radio is I suppose it's the radio failures and the fact that the animals that were collared, we were able to at least get data of territory establishment for a male and a female. The other two animals, the second male and female, we got a lot of data on them, and the female's wonderful. The data we got is great. She had I think 15 different den sites. Some of them she used repeatedly. Sometimes one would be used and then never again. The area that she's using is, as you'd expect a wild female marten to do. The male that's living in the same area is not ranging as much as we might have expected a wild male to do. But again, it's from the discussions I've had with the guys who work in Ireland, we should be careful about picking out facts from the literature and assuming that they'll play out everywhere. That's a real fatal mistake if you do that. So just because he's not got a particularly big range doesn't mean to say it's to do with the fact he's a captive animal. It could be entirely due to he doesn't need to have a big range. He's overlapping the female and he's got a good habitat with lots of food. So why range any further than that at this time of year? And the fact they've established these territories is wonderful. Also, none of the Martens have got into trouble. They haven't gone to hen houses. They haven't been knocking on people's doors, raiding anything, nothing. Stayed away from houses. They could. There's people living not far from where these animals are. They could visit gardens if they wanted to, and they don't do that. So they're obviously able to hunt. And as I said earlier, the key thing for us now is the dietary analysis. What have they been eating? The first few weeks, it was obvious they were eating a lot of fruit. There was a lot of fruit available. They're also eating insects. You see in the exoskeleton of ground beetles. So we would see that. Then latterly, we began to see hair, feather shafts, bone, mammals and birds. Again, interesting, and just as you'd expect a wild marten to do. So this is going to be quite interesting to look at. And then we want to examine the data, the spatial data, and actually work out what's the range size, what's the core area, where are they spending most of their time, and what are these areas? Are they woodland? Are they coming out of woodland? Are they using rough grassland? And how does that fit with the dietary analysis as we might expect if they're spending a lot of time in grassland, for there to be a lot of voles, small mammals in the scap. And then we can look at the denning behavior, which at the moment is, as I said, seems to reflect what you would expect a wild marten to do. They haven't been hefted to nest boxes particularly. One animal slightly, but the others not at all. They've avoided using the boxes that we put out. They've been using natural den sites. And here they are. So we have the female without the collar. And she obviously lives in the same, because it's the same place as this male who has his collar on. And then this is a female, and her tag is failed. So this needs to come off. We need to catch her and take this off. But there they are. And these are relatively recently. There's the 18th of January. This one's just before Christmas. And this is the turn of the year. And they're all looking good. The videos show them moving well. Nothing to be worried about. So future of the project, well, we're using captive animals. And so the limitation is obviously their availability, and they're a conservative breeder, and there aren't many of them in zoos. And also more and more people want martens. And so more and more people think, oh, we'll get some captive martens and we'll release captive martens where we are. So there might be competition for martens, which is great. I mean, the more projects there are, the better. But obviously, if the animals don't breed, no one gets any. And if they do breed, then you're limited to the sex ratio that's bred. And it may be a small number of females breed and they produce only male young. Not so great. If they produce all female young, that's preferable. So that's the big number one for our project, is to get more captive animals and release them in the Bangor area. Do all the radio tracking, get the student projects up and running, looking at diet, and then hoping that we might get some reproduction in the future. And that's a dream. If these captive martens can hunt and then they actually breed, and if they're successful and can wean offspring, that's a major win. Because if you read all the literature, what you shouldn't do is use small numbers of captive bred carnivores in a translocation project. All the literature says that is the worst option. But that it's based on small numbers of studies, and typically the studies are in North America. They're not European studies, so of mustelids. So this is, I believe this is certainly the first release of captive bred martens in the UK. I suspect it's probably the first release in Europe. And so it's interesting. One criticism we've had is why bother doing it? And the argument to push back on that is that if you're familiar with Tasmanian devil, you'll know that they developed a facial tumor disease some decades ago, which suddenly ended up with extensive pathogenic disease in populations where conservationists were rushing to remove animals from the wild and put them into captivity. And then everyone's trying to catch up with one another. How do you house these animals? How do you care for them? Well, we've got zoos in the UK who clearly know how to house and breed pine martens successfully. What we need is the ability to be able to put them back into the wild if we ended up in a scenario where something was happening to wild martens and causing catastrophic decline. And I've had mammalogists sort of scoff at that. And it's odd because none of us could predict the future. We're all walking around supermarkets, keeping 2 meters away from one another, wearing masks. 18 months ago, no one would have believed that that would be the UK. So we should be really careful. And I think this project will, even if we end up that the data's never useful in the context of a pathogenic outbreak, I still think it's worthwhile seeing whether captive martens can be translocated back into successfully into the landscape, and so far it's working relatively well. And so just to wind up, my co-editors Nikki, Peter, and Liz and I, we've about to publish this new book called Saving the Red Squirrel. It's a free download. You'll be able to get it off the Red Squirrels Trust Wales website once it's hosted there in the next week or so. And the first chapter is written by Josh Twining and Dave Tosh, and it's all about pine martens. The second chapter is immunocontraceptive. The third one's gene drive. And then there's a series of UK largely volunteer-led conservation initiatives on red squirrel. So that's a freebie. And if you're interested in the project that I've talked about, and you're on social media, Facebook, you can join the Gwynedd Pine Marten Project Facebook group. Thank you very much.